measurement. And this slide serves as a sort of table of contents. This is where we're heading. There are 4 types of data that we're going to look at in terms of the levels that they measure. So the first is interval, then ratio, then nominal, and then ordinal. These are the 4 things that we're going to cover in this recorded lecture. So let's begin with interval. This is for some the most difficult to understand, so let's get it out of the way. The key here is that there's no absolute 0 point. 0 in this case is not really a meaningful number. So the best example I can think of is related to temperature. If I were to ask students on a survey, what do you think is the ideal temperature? And maybe a student answers 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, and then another student maybe answers 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The student likes it cold. In this case, because it is interval data, 60 is not twice 30. Normally, in just regular, the number line, we would think of 30 times 2 is 60. But in this case, it's actually not true that 60 is twice as warm as 30. And that is because in the case of temperature, 0 does not mean there is an absence of heat. 0 is just happens to be the number we've assigned to that temperature, but it does not mean there is 0 heat. And so we would say there's no absolute 0 point when it comes to temperature. For the purposes of this course, we probably will not see too many examples of interval data, but it was worth you knowing that's what it means. So this is the kind of data you're working with when 0 is not a meaningful number, and we would say there is no absolute 0 point. It gets easier from here. So the next type is ratio. These are fixed values in which 0 is meaningful. So 0 means 0. So when we have 0 apples, that means there's an absence of apples. There are none. So this is probably how you think of most data that you come across. Now, sometimes people get interval and ratio, the names confused. And I like to say the easiest way to remember that ratio is the one that is assigned where we have a meaningful 0 is that you think about the example before where I said, 30 is not half of 60 in this case, and that's for interval data. What we're really talking about there are ratios. And so when it comes to ratio data, you can say that, for example, 30 is to 60 what 50 is to 100, because 50 is half of 100 and 30 is half of 60. And so those are ratios that I'm speaking about. And so therefore we can remember that that is ratio data. Nominal data it occurs when sometimes we are even using numbers to represent categories, but these numbers have no numeric meaning. They have no value. The numbers are just representing a way of organizing data, but we can't run calculations with them. We can't analyze those numbers because they're essentially meaningless. And so the best example I can think of there would be numbers on the jerseys of athletes. So, John might wear number 5 and Joe wears number 10. That doesn't mean that Joe is, better than John because he has a higher jersey number. It's those aren't numbers that we can take averages of. An average of 5 and 10 is 7.5. Okay, so what does that mean in this case? 7.5 means nothing in this case. So this is when we sometimes assign numbers, but they don't mean anything. And then finally, ordinal data is when the order of the values matter. And we're about to look at an example, I think, first of nominal, and then I'm going to come to an example of ordinal data, where you might rank things in a particular order. excuse me, they may not necessarily be representing people, but categories. Okay, now imagine I ask the class to rank the presidents from worst to best. And these are actual presidents. And let's just say, and you see I use the word hypothetical. Hypothetically, let's imagine a student said, okay, I'm going to give Bill Clinton 1 because he's the best. And I'm going to give Barack Obama 2, and then George H.W. Bush 3, George W. Bush 4, and Ronald Reagan 5. These now are in an order, and those numbers do have some meaning. Receiving a 1 versus a 5 does mean something and does have a value to it. But again, we're kind of limited in what we can do with ordinal data. There's not a whole lot of analysis you can make from these numbers, but we can say that they have meaning.